The rain in Larkspur had a way of making everything look older than it was, and the First Meridian Bank branch on Cedar Street was no exception. Its brass fixtures had gone dull years ago, and the carpet by the entrance had worn thin in a path that traced 4 decades of boots and work gloves coming through the door. Marcus Doyle pushed that door open at 4:10 on a Thursday afternoon, holding it with his shoulder while he guided his father's wheelchair over the threshold. Walter Doyle sat with a folder in his lap, the kind with a metal clasp, the settlement papers inside it creased from being reviewed too many times. His right hand, the one that still worked without hesitation since the stroke, rested on top of the folder like he was afraid the wind might take it. "You didn't have to come," Marcus said, "not for the first time that day." "I wanted to see it land," Walter answered. His speech had smoothed out in the last year, though certain words still came slower than others. 15 years is a long time to wait for a number on a piece of paper. Marcus didn't answer that. He wheeled his father toward the teller line, past a bulletin board advertising a car raffle for the volunteer fire department, past a stand of brochures nobody read. He knew this branch. He'd grown up 2 streets over, had opened his first savings account here at 11 years old with $40 from mowing lawns. He hadn't expected, walking in today, that the woman behind the counter with her hair pulled back and a laminated nameplate reading R. Doyle Chase would be his sister. Renata looked up before he said a word. Something moved behind her eyes, fast, and then it was gone, replaced by the flat professional calm she wore like a uniform. "Marcus." She didn't smile. "It's been a while, longer than it should have been." He kept his voice even, the way he did in client meetings when a number came in wrong and someone needed to stay calm about it. "I need to deposit a check. Settlement funds, from the estate matter." Renata's gaze moved to Walter, softened for half a second, then hardened again as it returned to Marcus. "You brought Dad. He wanted to be here." Marcus set the check on the counter and slid it toward her. Renata glanced down, and whatever she expected to see, it wasn't the number printed across the middle of it. Her hand, reaching for the standard verification stamp, stopped in midair. "This is a joke." "It's not a joke. You want me to believe you're depositing $412,000. She said it slowly, like she was testing whether the words would hold together. "Marcus, I balanced your checkbook for you in college. I know what your business looked like 8 years ago. I know what it probably looks like now. You don't, actually." He kept his tone level. "Call the issuing institution. It'll take 5 minutes." A young teller 2 windows down, name tag reading Priya Anand, had already reached for the check out of habit, the automatic motion of someone trained to verify first and ask questions after. Renata's hand came down flat on the counter, not touching the check, but close enough that Priya pulled back. "I've got this one," Renata said, not looking at her. Walter shifted in his chair. "Renata, I'm handling a customer, Dad." The word customer landed wrong, and Marcus felt it land, though he didn't let it show. A woman near the entrance lowered her umbrella and glanced over, sensing the air in the lobby had changed temperature. Renata picked the check back up, studied it once more, then looked at her brother with an expression he recognized from 15 years ago. The one she used to wear across the dinner table when their mother was in the hospital and someone had to be the one holding everything together. "You left," she said, quiet enough that it was almost just for him. "You left me with the company, with Dad, with all of it, and now you walk in here with a fake number expecting me to just process it because you finally decided to show up. Renata, that number isn't fake. I don't believe you." Her hands weren't quite steady now. "I think you're either lying to me or someone gave you a check that isn't going to clear. And either way, I'm not putting it through without something better than your word." Walter's grip on the folder tightened, his knuckles going pale. "Renata, this isn't the moment for this. With respect, Dad, I don't think you're in a position to tell me what the moment is." Her voice hadn't risen, but something in it had gone sharp enough to cut through the low murmur of the lobby. She held the check for another second, looking directly at her brother, 15 years of something unspoken sitting behind her eyes. Then she tore it in half. Not folded, not set aside. Torn, once, and then again, the pieces drifting down onto the worn carpet at Marcus's feet. Walter made a sound low in his throat and reached toward the floor with his good hand, the wheelchair rocking slightly as he leaned. Marcus caught his father's shoulder before he could tip forward, steadying him, his jaw tight but his voice, when it came, still quiet. "You didn't have to do that in front of him. I don't owe you a controlled reaction." "Marcus." Renata's hands were shaking now, though her expression hadn't cracked. "People like you don't walk in here after 15 years with $400,000 and expect everyone to just believe it." She reached for the phone at her station, lifting it before Marcus could answer, her eyes never leaving his face. "Jordan," she called toward the security guard stationed near the entrance, a young man who had watched the last 3 minutes without understanding a word of what he'd seen. "Escort him out. 15 years is a strange thing to measure. It's long enough to become someone else entirely, and short enough that the sound of your own sister's voice can still put you right back in a room you thought you'd left for good." Marcus didn't move while Jordan crossed the lobby toward him. He kept his hand steady on his father's shoulder and let his mind go somewhere else, the way he'd trained himself to do years ago whenever a room turned hostile and there was nothing useful to do with his hands. It went, without his choosing it, back to the workshop. Their mother, Eleanor Doyle, had died on a Tuesday in March, in the same bed she'd slept in for 31 years, with Walter holding one hand and Renata holding the other. Marcus had been 600 miles away at the time, 3 days into a job that wasn't going well, and he hadn't made it back until the morning after the funeral, his flight delayed twice, his rental car sliding on ice he hadn't accounted for. He remembered walking into the house and finding it already rearranged, boxes stacked in the hallway that hadn't been there when he left, Renata's handwriting on the labels. She'd been 29 then, 7 years older than Marcus, and she'd spent most of those 7 years being the one who stayed. She'd taken business classes at the community college while Marcus chased scholarship offers 2 states away. She'd learned to read a balance sheet before she'd learned to drive stick, mostly because their mother had needed help keeping Doyle Construction's books straight. And Walter had never been a numbers man, only a man who could frame a house faster than anyone in 3 counties and had no patience for anything that couldn't be measured with a level. "You weren't here," Renata told him, 3 days after the funeral, standing in the office trailer at the edge of the company's lumberyard, a space that smelled permanently of sawdust and burnt coffee. "You haven't been here in years, Marcus." "Not really. I had a job, I was building something. You were running." She hadn't raised her voice. That was the thing about Renata even then, she didn't need volume, she had precision instead, and she used it like a scalpel. "You've been running since you were 19. And now Mom's gone, and Dad can barely hold a pencil steady some mornings without his hand shaking, and you want to walk back in here after everyone else did the work and just take your third like it's owed to you." It wasn't about the money. Marcus had tried to tell her that at the time, and he still believed it now, wheeling their father through a lobby that smelled nothing like sawdust. It had never been about the money. It was about being told, flatly and without room for negotiation, that the seat at the table he'd grown up assuming would always be his had already been given away in his absence. Their mother's will had left the company jointly to both of them, with Walter retaining a controlling share until his death. But Eleanor, in the last exhausted months of her illness, had signed a separate document naming Renata sole executor of the estate, a decision Marcus later understood came from nothing more sinister than the fact that Renata was the one in the room, day after day, while Marcus was on a job site trying to keep his own fledgling engineering consultancy from collapsing under him. Executor authority wasn't ownership, but in a family business run out of a trailer with more handshake agreements than contracts, the distinction hadn't mattered much in practice. Renata used that authority to freeze Marcus's stake pending a review of operational fitness, a phrase Marcus was fairly sure she'd pulled from some business seminar and never fully believed in herself, not even while she was saying it. The review never happened. There was nothing to review. What there was, instead, was 6 months of Renata quietly restructuring the company's ownership documents with a lawyer Marcus never got to meet, 6 months of phone calls that went unreturned, 6 months of Walter saying almost nothing at all. Sitting in his recliner with the television on, letting his daughter handle what he apparently didn't have the strength to referee. "You always thought this place was beneath you," Renata said the last time they stood in that workshop together, the day Marcus finally understood the ground had already shifted under him for good. "You couldn't wait to leave. And now you want to walk back in and just take a third of something you never once helped build. I helped build it every summer since I was 12. You left when you turned 18 and you didn't look back until Mom died." That part was true enough that Marcus hadn't had an answer for it, not then. What he hadn't understood yet, what wouldn't surface for years, was that his mother's last months had been shaped by more than grief and exhaustion. There'd been a conversation between Eleanor and Walter that neither of their children had been part of, something involving Walter's younger brother, a man named Frank Doyle whose name nobody in the family said out loud anymore. And a mistake made a generation earlier that Walter had spent 30 years trying to make sure never repeated itself. Marcus wouldn't learn any of that for a long time. All he knew, standing in that trailer at 26 years old with nothing but a duffel bag and a business card from a firm 3 states away, was that his sister had looked him in the eye and told him, without a trace of doubt in her voice, that he didn't belong there anymore. He left 2 days later. He didn't call for over a year. When he finally did, it was Walter who picked up, and the conversation lasted 4 minutes and covered nothing that mattered. Marcus built his engineering firm from a rented desk in a shared office space, the kind with folding chairs and a coffee maker that only worked half the time, using every dollar he had and most of what he could borrow, driven less by ambition than by a need to prove, to no one in particular, that Renata had been wrong about him. He never went back to that workshop. He'd told himself for 15 years that he never needed to. Now he was standing in a bank lobby watching his sister's security guard walk toward him, torn paper scattered across the floor at his father's feet, and the thought that surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome, was that some part of him had never really left that trailer at all. The years between that afternoon and this one hadn't moved in a straight line so much as accumulated, one contract and one sleepless night at a time, until enough of them had piled up that Marcus almost didn't recognize the life he'd built on top of them. He'd started Doyle Structural Solutions with $11,000, a laptop that overheated if he ran 2 programs at once, and a folding table he still kept in a storage unit because some part of him refused to throw it away. The first 2 years nearly broke him. He underbid jobs to get his name on them, slept in his truck more nights than he wanted to count when a client was 3 states over and a motel wasn't in the budget, and learned the particular exhaustion of doing the work of an entire firm by himself while still answering every email like there were 40 employees behind him. A credit union loan officer named Thomas Okafor had approved his very first line of business credit back then, $6,200 against equipment Marcus barely owned yet. Thomas hadn't needed to say yes. The numbers on paper hadn't earned it, but he'd looked across the desk at a 27-year-old with calluses on his hands and a business plan written in pencil, and he'd taken a chance that most people in his position wouldn't have. Marcus never forgot it. He sent Thomas a card every year at the holidays. And when Thomas moved on to a compliance role at a regional bank a few years later, Marcus kept sending them anyway. By his early 30s, the underbidding had stopped. Word had gotten around in engineering circles that Doyle Structural did difficult retrofits other firms wouldn't touch, old timber frame buildings, aging bridges, structures that needed to be saved rather than replaced, and the difficult jobs paid better once people understood you were the only one who could do them right. Marcus hired his first employee at 32. By 38, he had a staff of 14 and a reputation that reached well past the state line. None of it made him call home. He told himself, in the years when he still bothered explaining it to himself at all, that there was nothing to go back to. Renata had made that clear enough in the workshop the day he left. But the truth, the one he didn't examine too closely, was that success without reconciliation felt safer than success that might get rejected all over again. It was easier to build something far away than to find out his sister still saw him as the boy who ran. The call about his father came on a Sunday in early spring, from a neighbor, not from Renata. Walter had collapsed in his driveway clearing the last of a late snowfall, and by the time the ambulance reached the hospital in Larkspur, the left side of his face had already started to droop. Marcus drove through the night to get there, 6 hours on empty highway, and found his father in a hospital bed with tubes running into the back of one hand and a look of confused fury on his face that told Marcus, even before the doctor said a word, that some part of Walter Doyle understood exactly how much had just been taken from him. The stroke left him with a right hand that no longer obeyed him reliably and a walk that had, within a few months, become a wheelchair. His speech came back mostly whole, though certain words still stuck sometimes, catching in his throat like a nail half-hammered. He needed care beyond what the house on Cedar Ridge Road could offer, care that came with a price tag that made Marcus's stomach drop the first time a facility director slid a brochure across a desk toward him. He'd visited 4 of those facilities over the following months, sitting at his father's bedside afterward with glossy folders spread across the blanket, reading aloud the parts about physical therapy programs and memory care wings while Walter studied the photographs with an expression Marcus couldn't quite name. Not quite hope, something closer to a man taking inventory of what was left to him. This one, Walter had said once, tapping a folder with his good hand, a place 40 minutes outside Larkspur with a view of the water and a staff-to-resident ratio that made it the most expensive of the 4. If we're doing this, Marcus, do it right. Marcus hadn't had the money. Not the kind of money that facility required, not on top of everything else. What he'd had, instead, was a lawyer he'd hired 18 months earlier, quietly, without telling anyone in Larkspur, to finally settle the question that had sat unresolved for 15 years, his legal stake in Doyle Construction, the company his mother's will had always intended to leave him a third of. Renata had never formally taken that stake from him. She'd simply frozen it, buried it in paperwork, let it sit untouched long enough that most people, including Marcus for a long time, assumed it had quietly ceased to exist. It hadn't. It had just been waiting, and once Marcus's lawyer started asking the right questions of the right people, the company's own attorneys had moved to settle rather than let a 15-year-old ownership dispute become public. $412,000, structured as a full buyout of his interest. Arrived by wire transfer into escrow on a Tuesday in early spring, with a physical check to follow for the portion he'd requested in paper form, the way his father still preferred to see things made real. Renata had signed off on the settlement herself, as company president. If she'd registered the name on the paperwork as her brother's, nothing in the wording of the agreement showed it. It had moved through lawyers, not through people. Marcus sat with his father the evening the check arrived, the two of them going over the numbers at the kitchen table in the house Marcus had moved back into to manage Walter's care, the facility brochure open between them. "Half of this goes toward getting you settled somewhere good," Marcus said. "The other half I want to put toward something for kids starting out the way I did. No safety net, nobody willing to take a chance on them." Walter's eyes, when they met his son's, were wet in a way that had nothing to do with the stroke. "Your mother would have liked that. I know, you'll need to deposit it somewhere." Walter's good hand tapped the check lightly. "Might as well do it right. In person. Make sure it's done properly." Marcus looked at the branch address printed at the top of the settlement letter, First Meridian, the Larkspur location, the one 2 miles from the house he'd grown up in. He hadn't set foot inside it in 15 years. He had no particular reason to think anyone there would know his face, let alone his name. "I want to come with you," Walter said before Marcus could answer the question out loud. "I want to see it land." Marcus studied his father for a long moment, then folded the settlement letter and slid it into his jacket pocket. "All right," he said. "Tuesday, then. We'll do it together." Jordan Reyes didn't move right away. He'd been standing near the entrance since his shift started that morning, mostly watching the rain streak down the glass and thinking about nothing in particular, the way security work in a town like Larkspur usually went. He'd heard the exchange building at the counter for the better part of 5 minutes now, and nothing in it had matched what a threat was supposed to sound like. A man asking, calmly, for a check to be verified. An older man in a wheelchair saying almost nothing at all. No raised voices except the ones coming from behind the counter. "Jordan." Renata's voice cut across the lobby again, sharper this time. "I said escort him out." He crossed the floor slowly, each step feeling heavier than it should have. When he reached Marcus, he didn't take his arm. He just stood there, close enough to look like he was following the order, far enough that anyone watching closely would see he hadn't actually touched him. "Sir, I think we should step outside," Jordan said quietly, and something in his tone made it sound more like an apology than a command. "We're not going anywhere," Marcus said, "until someone actually looks at that check instead of deciding they already know what it is." Priya Anand, 2 windows down, had gone still behind her station, watching the scene the way you watch something you already suspect is going wrong and can't yet prove it. She'd worked under Renata for a year and a half, long enough to have learned which customers got escalated calmly and which ones got escalated like this, fast, personal, final before the verification process had even started. She'd seen it twice before with other customers. Both times she'd told herself it wasn't her place to say anything. Both times the feeling had stayed with her longer than she wanted to admit. "Ms. Doyle Chase," Priya said carefully, "I can still run the verification. It'll only take a minute. I don't need you to run anything, Priya. I've got this handled." Walter's wheelchair had drifted slightly during the exchange, one wheel catching on a scrap of torn paper still scattered across the carpet, rocking the chair just enough that he had to grip the armrest to steady himself. Marcus's hand found his father's shoulder instantly, an old reflex built over 3 years of managing a body that no longer moved the way it used to. "Dad, you good?" Walter nodded, but his jaw was tight, and when he spoke, the words came slower than usual, the way they did when his frustration outran his mouth's ability to keep up. This isn't how it's supposed to go, Renata. You don't get a say in how I run my branch, Dad." She said it fast, almost before she could stop herself, and something crossed her face immediately afterward that looked, for just a fraction of a second, like she wished she could take it back. She didn't take it back. That was the moment Marcus's composure, which had held through 15 years in a torn check and every insult aimed directly at him, finally started to give. "You don't get to talk to him like that," he said, and his voice had dropped into a register the lobby hadn't heard from him yet, still quiet. but with an edge underneath it that made two customers near the entrance stop pretending not to watch. Like what, Marcus? Like a man who spent 15 years deciding the rest of us weren't worth a phone call? This isn't about 15 years ago. This is about you, right now, humiliating our father in front of a room full of strangers because you'd rather believe I'm lying than believe anything's changed. Nothing's changed, Renata said, and her hands, Marcus noticed, weren't quite steady anymore, even as her voice stayed hard. You still think you can walk into a room and rewrite what everyone already knows about you. I know exactly what you're capable of, Marcus. I watched you leave. I watched Dad's hands shake for a year afterward, and not because of any stroke. Walter's expression cracked at that, something old and pained surfacing behind his eyes, but he didn't speak. Marcus filed the moment away without understanding it yet. Renata reached for the phone at her station. I'm calling this in, she said. Attempted fraud. I want it documented, and I want you both off this property. Renata, Marcus kept his voice level, though it cost him something to do it. Call the issuing institution. That's all I've asked from the beginning. 5 minutes, and this is over. I don't need 5 minutes to know what I already know. She lifted the receiver, punched in 3 numbers, and held it to her ear, her eyes never leaving her brother's face. Yes, this is First Meridian, Larkspur branch. I need to report an attempted fraudulent deposit, and I need officers on site. The lobby had gone almost entirely silent by then, the kind of silence that draws more attention than shouting ever could. A woman near the brochure stand had her phone raised, recording without trying to hide it. An older man waiting at the second window had stopped pretending to read the notice board on the wall. Jordan still hadn't touched Marcus. He stood there, caught between an order he didn't believe in and a job he needed, his hand hovering somewhere near Marcus's elbow without ever closing around it. Walter reached up and gripped his son's wrist, his fingers weaker than they used to be but tight all the same. Marcus, let it go for now. We'll come back. I'm not leaving you here to be talked about like you're not in the room, Dad. Renata was still on the phone, giving the dispatcher details in a voice that had gone flat and procedural, the sound of someone reciting a story she'd already decided was true. She hadn't looked away from her brother once. That was when the front doors opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the sound of rain. And a man in a gray overcoat stepped into the lobby, stopped mid-stride at the sight of torn paper on the floor and a wheelchair caught against the carpet, and said, in a voice that carried clean across the room, Marcus Doyle? What in God's name is going on here? Thomas Okafor didn't wait for an answer. He crossed the lobby in long strides, his coat still dripping rain onto the carpet, his eyes moving fast between the torn paper, Walter's wheelchair, and Marcus's face, doing the same rapid calculation Marcus imagined he did with every loan file that crossed his desk: assess first, react second. Marcus, he said it again, quieter this time, like he needed to hear himself say it to believe it. I thought that was you. Thomas. Marcus felt something in his chest loosen slightly, though the rest of him stayed braced. It's been a while. Renata still had the phone against her ear, though the dispatcher call had gone quiet, the line apparently on hold. She stared at Thomas the way a person stares at a piece of furniture that has suddenly started speaking. You two know each other, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I approved his first business line of credit almost 15 years ago. Thomas's eyes hadn't left Marcus. $6,200. I still remember the number because everyone in the review committee thought I was out of my mind. He glanced at the torn scraps of paper scattered near the wheelchair's front wheel, and something in his expression hardened. What happened here? Your branch manager tore up a settlement check in front of my father, Marcus said, and called it fraud without running a single verification. Thomas turned to Renata slowly. Is that true? I had every reason to believe. Renata. Thomas's voice wasn't raised, but it carried the particular weight of someone who outranked everyone else in the room and rarely needed to remind people of it. Do you have any idea who this is? He's my brother, she said, and for the first time since Marcus had walked through the door, something in her voice cracked. Just slightly, at the edges. I know exactly who he is. Then you know Doyle Structural Solutions just signed a retrofit contract with Larkspur Timber Holdings. Thomas said it flatly, like he was reading off a memo, though Marcus could tell from the tightness around his eyes that the words cost him something too. Which happens to be this bank's largest regional shareholder. Which means the man whose check you just tore in half is, as of 11 days ago, connected to the parent company that owns this branch's paper. The color left Renata's face in a way that had nothing to do with recognizing her brother and everything to do with recognizing the shape of what she'd just done. I didn't know that, she said quietly. You didn't ask, Thomas said. That's the problem. You didn't verify. You decided you already knew the answer, and you acted on 15 years of something that had nothing to do with banking procedure. Priya, still standing frozen at her station, spoke up before she could stop herself. There was time to verify. I tried. Thomas glanced at her name tag, then back at Renata. Is that true? Renata didn't answer. She set the phone down slowly, the dispatcher still holding somewhere on the other end, and for a moment she just stood there, looking at the torn pieces of paper on the carpet like she was seeing them for the first time. End the call, Thomas said. Tell them it's resolved. She picked the phone back up, said 3 sentences into it in a voice gone flat and mechanical, and set it down again. The lobby, which had gathered a small cluster of onlookers by then, stayed quiet, watching a scene none of them fully understood but all of them recognized as consequential. Thomas turned back to Marcus and Walter. I am sorry, both of you. This isn't how First Meridian treats any customer, let alone one connected to this bank the way you are. He crouched slightly to Walter's eye level. Mr. Doyle, are you all right? Walter nodded, though his jaw was still tight, his good hand still gripping the wheelchair's armrest. The check is torn, Marcus said. I assume that's fixable. It's fixable within the hour. What isn't fixable is what your father just sat through. Thomas straightened, looked at Renata again, and his voice went formal in a way that made clear the conversation had moved from personal to procedural. I need you to step away from the counter. I'll need a full incident report, and I'm placing you on administrative suspension effective immediately. Pending review. Thomas, this isn't a discussion, Renata. Not after what 4 separate witnesses just watched you do. She didn't argue further. She stepped back from the counter, her hands empty, her composure gone in a way Marcus hadn't seen from her since the week their mother died. He felt, watching her, none of the satisfaction he might have expected 15 years ago, lying awake in a rented office above a machine shop, imagining some version of this exact moment. What he felt instead was tired, and something close to sad, though he couldn't yet say for whom. Thomas walked them into a small office behind the teller line, apologizing again, offering coffee neither of them wanted. He pulled up Marcus's account information on a monitor, confirmed the contract details, confirmed the settlement was legitimate and properly executed, and began the process of reissuing the check while a junior staffer photographed the torn original for the incident file. It was while Thomas was on a call with the branch's compliance office that Priya knocked quietly and stepped inside, holding a slim cardboard box she'd apparently retrieved from a back storage room. I don't know if this matters, she said, setting it on the desk, but when I was pulling old account files for the audit trail, I found something mixed in with them. It's not bank material. It looks personal. Company ledgers, maybe 20 years old. I think they got filed here by mistake a long time ago, back when Doyle Construction still banked at this branch. Marcus opened the box out of instinct more than curiosity, expecting nothing. Inside were a handful of worn accounting ledgers in his mother's handwriting, some old correspondence, and near the bottom, a folded letter addressed to Renata in his father's unmistakable block print, dated a little over 15 years earlier. It had never been sent. It had simply been filed away, forgotten, alongside numbers that no longer mattered to anyone but the family that once needed them balanced. Marcus looked at his father. Walter's expression had gone still in a way that had nothing to do with the stroke. Dad, what is this? Walter's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the letter, though whether from the stroke or something else, Marcus couldn't tell. Marcus, he said slowly, each word costing him something. There's something you don't know. Something about your Uncle Frank, and what I asked your sister to do. Marcus set the box down and looked at his father for a long moment, the torn check forgotten, a new and unfamiliar tension settling into the room. Tell me, he said. All of it. Walter didn't answer right away. And when Marcus finally stepped back out into the lobby an hour later, the reissued check in hand, Renata was still there, sitting alone near the entrance where Thomas had asked her to wait, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. Marcus walked toward her, not to accuse her further, not yet to forgive her either. We need to talk, he said. Somewhere private, just the two of us. They found an empty conference room down the hall, the kind with a scuffed table and a whiteboard someone had never quite managed to erase. Renata sat first, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Marcus closed the door and stood for a moment before taking the chair across from her, the distance between them feeling larger than the width of the table. Dad told me about Uncle Frank, he said. About the letter, about what you did 15 years ago, and why. Renata's composure, which had been fraying since Thomas walked through the front doors, finally gave way entirely. She pressed a hand over her mouth for a moment, And when she spoke, her voice had none of the hardness he remembered from the workshop. "He asked me not to tell you," she said. "He made me promise. He said if you knew Frank had run the company into the ground the same way, chasing some idea nobody else believed in, dragging the whole family down with him before he disappeared, he said you'd never forgive either of us for holding it over you. So he asked me to just be the one who said no. To make it my decision instead of a warning he was too ashamed to give you himself." Marcus sat with that for a long moment. It didn't erase what had happened in the lobby an hour earlier. It didn't erase 15 years of silence, or the way she'd looked at their father in front of a room full of strangers and called him nothing more than a customer. But it changed the shape of the wound, at least a little, from something purely cruel into something more complicated, inherited, maybe, in a way neither of them had chosen. "That doesn't explain today," he said finally. "Dad wasn't asking you to protect me from anything today. He was standing right there. And you still tore that check apart like you'd been waiting 15 years for the chance." "I know." Renata's voice cracked on the second word. "I've asked myself the same thing since the second I did it, and the honest answer is I don't have a good one. I saw you walk in with that number, and something in me just," she stopped, shook her head. "I think some part of me needed you to still be the person who left. Because if you weren't, then everything I gave up to stay here, all of it, was just me choosing wrong." It wasn't an excuse. Marcus didn't take it as one. But it was the first honest thing his sister had said to him in 15 years, and something about hearing it loosened a knot in his chest he hadn't realized was still there. "Thomas is going to recommend termination," he said. "The false report alone could end your license. I could let that happen. 15 years ago I probably would have wanted to." Renata didn't argue, didn't defend herself further. She just nodded, like she'd already made peace with whatever came next. "I'm not going to let that happen," Marcus said. "Not because you deserve a pass. You don't, but because destroying you doesn't fix anything, and I'm tired of both of us building our whole lives around who owes who the most." He told her what he'd already decided. Sitting in Thomas's office while the reissued check printed, he wouldn't press for termination, only for a formal reprimand. A mandatory retraining program, and Renata's removal from any customer-facing role for the next year. She'd keep her position at the bank, in some capacity, but the branch manager title was gone, and she knew at the moment he said it, accepting it without protest. "Why," she asked quietly, "would you do that for me, after what I just did to you?" "To Dad? I'm not doing it for you," Marcus said. "I'm doing it because Dad doesn't have time left to spend it watching his kids tear each other apart. And because some kid is going to walk into a bank someday needing someone to give him a chance nobody else will, the way Thomas Okafor gave me one. I'd rather build something with the years I've got than spend them making sure you lose everything." Walter's care began within the week. The facility he'd chosen from the brochures, the one with the water view and the staff-to-resident ratio he'd insisted on, accepted him on a Thursday, and Marcus drove him there himself, Renata following in her own car without being asked. The first time in 15 years the three of them had been anywhere together that wasn't a hospital room or a bank lobby. Walter settled into his new room slowly, arranging a few framed photographs on the windowsill with his good hand while his children stood near the door, not quite looking at each other, not quite looking away either. "You two are speaking," Walter said, not quite a question, watching them from his chair with something unreadable in his expression. "We're talking," Marcus said. "That's different from fixed." "It's a start," Renata said, and for the first time all day, something almost like a smile crossed her face, small and uncertain. Walter nodded slowly, satisfied, it seemed, with that much. It was more than he'd had reason to expect in a long time, watching his children stand in the same room without either of them walking out. Marcus never announced what he did with the remaining settlement funds. He didn't put his name on it, didn't ask for a plaque or a grant letter with his signature at the bottom. He simply wired the money, quietly, into a trade apprenticeship program 2 counties over, one built for kids aging out of foster care with no family construction business to inherit and no fallback if the first opportunity didn't pan out. The program's director never learned who'd funded it. Marcus preferred it that way. He visited his father every weekend after that. Some weekends, Renata's car was already in the lot when he arrived. Some weekends it wasn't. They hadn't found their way back to anything that looked like the family they might have been if none of it had happened: the workshop, the will, the 15 years, the torn check on a bank floor. Marcus wasn't sure that family still existed, or if it ever really had. But on the drive home from the facility one Sunday evening, his phone buzzed with a text from Renata, 4 words long, the first she'd sent him in 15 years that wasn't about paperwork or the past. Same time next week? Marcus looked at it for a long moment before he answered.